So welcome everyone to this SHSAT workshop. My name's Aisha. I'm a tutor with Ivy Tutors Network, and I've been a tutor for about 8 or 9 years, and a few of those years spent tutoring the SHSAT. So in addition to tutoring, I am a writer. I like to write stories, novels and short stories, and I'm also into history. We're going to be discussing all aspects, or as much as we can, do a detailed overview of the SHSAT test. As you guys might already know, for entrance into the specialized high schools, this is the only metric, right? So doing well on this test is the only hurdle you have to cross to gain admission to one of the specialized high schools. And maybe because of that fact, it's a challenging test, right? It's a hard test. A lot of the cutoffs are in the 500s range, and the test is out of 800. So even the best students are likely to get somewhere in the 500s range. I don't have statistics on that, but that has to be the case, right? Because that's often where a lot of the cutoffs are, which is not to say that you can just stroll in and say, well, I don't need to get an 800, no big deal. It's a hard test. Getting to that cutoff range takes some amount of work. But it's also a test that there are a lot of resources to prepare for. As long as you don't leave it to the last minute and you work on the areas that you need to work on, there's no reason why you can't, get a good score on the test. What I wanted to start with today, so first introductions and then just diving into the outline of what the test looks like. So first we're going to talk about the actual structure of the test, and then we're going to talk about the content. So what is the stuff that you need to study to do well on the test? So I'm just going to share a whiteboard with everyone. I want to start by just giving a little map of what the SHSAT looks like. It is 3 hours or 180 minutes. And what are the two main sections on the test? This also, I'm sure you all know. One is math, right? Which is half that. So I should say that the test as a whole is 180 minutes, and you can use those 180 minutes however you want. There are two sections. There's math and there's ELA, but nobody's going to be there telling you how long to spend on one and how long to spend on the other. That said, I do really recommend splitting it halfway because there's the same number of questions on both sections. Some students might be really much better at one than the other and are able to get through early. Nonetheless, in all your practice and leading up to the test, I think the goal is to get to a point where you're spending 90 minutes on one and 90 on the other. And then if you have extra time left at the end, you can revise the section that you're still on. And then if you have extra time left, you can move on to the other one. That's what I recommend. But students often find as they're doing their prep that for some people, it might work better to just switch it up a little bit. In terms of which section you start with, that's also completely up to you. Some students like to start with math and some like to start with ELA. I generally say that you should start with the section that, at least when you're first starting off and doing practice tests, try starting with the section that you like more. Because then when you've spent 90 minutes on it and you get to the next section, you might not be quite as bogged down. You might be able to do your best performance on the section that you like and are generally good at if you start with that one. But that's something to try out in your practice tests and see how it works so that you can always adjust if need be. So, okay, I am going to put that math is 90 minutes and ELA is 90 minutes. Again, no one's enforcing that, but that's what I always recommend. And Ivy, if I'm missing any important questions that you think I should address, feel free to just unmute and make me aware of them because I'm not able to look at the chat. Okay, so those are the main two sections, right? We're going to draw a little tree like this. Now, under the math section, we it's not divided by topics or anything like that, but we do have two different kinds of questions that we see on the math section. Now, does anyone happen to know already what those two kinds of questions are under math? Feel free to
Yeah.
Yes, please share. Who is this?
So there is a So there is a like a open response and a multiple choice response.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
What's your name?
Nicholas.
Nicholas, thank you, Nicholas. So Nicholas is exactly right. There are some questions that don't have any multiple choice options under them, and those are on the test. They're called grid-in questions, and that's because you fill in a grid in order to answer them. You're going to come up with the answer after you do the math. You're going to come up with the answer yourself, and it's going to be a number, it's going to be some sort of value, and you're going to plug that into a little grid on the answer sheet. So those are called grid-in questions, and there's only 5 of them. So 5 grid-in questions. I want to move that over here. Good. And then the rest, right, 52 of them, so the vast majority are multiple choice. Great. And I didn't leave much room, but I will just do that. Okay, so that's the 2 different kinds of questions you will see on the math section. What about ELA? So ELA has 2 different, I would say, sort of subsections on it. Does anyone happen to know what those are?
Yeah, there's revising and editing, and then there's like reading the passages and doing multiple choice.
Yes, exactly. Thank you. What's your name?
Elise.
Okay, thanks, Elise. Yeah, Elise is exactly right. So we have revising and editing. I'm going to put that on the left. And I'll put more into what each of these is in a second. So don't worry if you're like, what? And reading comprehension is what it's called. And Elise is exactly right that involves reading passages and often 1 or 2 poems. Not often, always. So passages including poems, and then answering questions about the content. So I started with reading comprehension. That is about understanding the content. Revising editing is more about grammar, punctuation, and what to include or remove from a longer passage. So revising editing does include one passage, but you're going to approach that passage very differently from the passages in reading comprehension. And we'll go into that more in a second. So this is the main structure of the SHSAT. And I should mention that within revising and editing, there's kind of 2 subsections. The first one is revising editing part A, and the second one is revising editing part B. Unsurprisingly, A and B. And we will go into what the difference is between them in a second. I'll just quickly mention that A is about looking at shorter pieces of information, shorter sentences or shorter paragraphs, and identifying any grammatical or punctuation errors. Whereas B is about looking at the flow of ideas in a longer passage and making sure that there's no extraneous information in the passage and adding information that might belong well in the passage, adding that in. And all of this is multiple choice. So you're not going to have to take a pencil to like a sentence and like correct it yourself. You're going to be given some options and you're going to choose from them. So we're going to move on from this chart to talking about the actual topics that will be on the SHSAT. So what are the math topics that you have to study? What comes under ELA? All of that. Let's dive into the topics on the SHSAT. Okay, so starting with math. I would say there's roughly 5 categories for the math that's on the SHSAT. Can anyone name what of them might be? Yeah.
What I realized, like, this is Venn diagram type of thing, where where it's like how many people have been surveyed, and then you have to subtract.
It's very rare that you see a Venn diagram on the test, but if you did, I mean, sometimes it can be useful to make a Venn diagram yourself to answer certain questions. And that would come under statistics, which is often lumped in with probability on the test. So probability and statistics, you're absolutely right. That is one of the topics under math. Can anyone name another one?
There's algebra.
Algebra, exactly, absolutely. Quite a bit of algebra on the test. It tends to be algebra most of the time with one variable. Sometimes there's questions with two variables, but most of the time just one. So algebra includes equations, right? So mathematical expressions that have an equal to sign in the middle, and it also includes inequalities when you have like a less than or greater than symbol in the middle. Okay, great. Any others?
Geometry.
Geometry. The other two I would categorize as numbers and operations, and that includes like PEMDAS. You always want to remember PEMDAS, right? That will apply for the rest of your life if you're doing math. Other basically arithmetic operations, multiplication, addition, subtraction, that sort of stuff, fractions, decimals, all that stuff. And then the last one I would say is ratios and proportions. So we can talk more about that if anyone has questions, but that includes percentages, right? Percentages are just proportions where the denominator is 100. You can think of the fraction where the denominator is 100. The whole is represented by 100. So those are the 5 topics that under math that come up on the SHSAT. And what I find helpful for students is, you know, at the start of your prep, you take a practice test and you might already know which of these topics you don't as well as the others, but you take a practice test and you see which topics, which of these 5 topics you tend to make the most mistakes and or know how to do the questions in. And then you start there, right? Test taking and tips and tricks to doing well at test taking, that's a big part of it, right? Getting used to taking a test. But there's nothing like knowing the content, right? You do need to be comfortable with the content in order to do well on the test. We'll talk about that more in a second, but yeah, there's 2 parts to it, right? One is content, and the other one is test taking and how to approach test taking, how to practice test taking. Okay, so that's math. Now let's talk about what's under ELA. So we did already go into this slightly, but so under revising editing, we have, as I mentioned, grammar, right? So that's like, can anyone give me some examples of what might come under grammar?
Like commas and punctuation.
Yeah, so I'm going to treat punctuation as a separate category, but you could include it in here. What's an example of something that's more about how we use words and how a sentence should be structured?
Usage.
Word choice.
Word choice, sure. Word choice tends to fall under syntax and more like, but yeah, if you're using an incorrect word, I would say that that's not right grammar, and that does come up in this section, so sure. Word choice. Another one is subject-verb agreement, right? So a big part of the grammar on the SHSAT is making sure that different parts of your sentence agree with each other. So for instance, if you have like, this is not an example that's likely to come up, but something like he go to the market, right? That verb go does not agree with the subject, he. It should be he goes to the market, right? That's a simplified example, but that's the kind of thing that you're going to see on the SHSAT. Different parts of the sentence not lining up. So subject, verb, agreement is what I just talked about. There's other kinds of agreement like pronoun agreement. So for instance, if you say the dog loved the dog, or that's harder to come up with an example for because you could call a dog he or she. But let's say the boy loved its ice cream. That it is the wrong pronoun, right? The word boy should be replaced with he as a pronoun. So that's pronoun agreement. Grammar, punctuation, as someone pointed out. And then the last one, and this is the part B. Part B deals with, as I mentioned, in part B, you're going to be looking at a passage and talking about or answering questions related to the flow of ideas in the passage. So the trick there is to be able to identify the main idea of paragraphs and the main idea of the passage as a whole. And any sentence that, as you're reading, sticks out, it just doesn't belong where it is, it's not supporting the idea of the paragraph, you're going to get a question about deleting extraneous sentences, and you want to look out for those. You might get a question about adding in sentences that help support ideas in the passage. And there also, you want to be able to identify the main topic of the passage as a whole, and also the topic, sentence, or the main idea of a paragraph, so that you can insert sentences that actually belong to the flow of ideas. Part B deals with flow of ideas in a passage / identifying main idea passage and paragraph. Okay, we're going to talk about reading comprehension. Before that, does anyone have any questions? If not, I'll keep going. So now reading comprehension. This is all about, as someone mentioned, it's all about reading passages, right? Reading different kinds of passages. So they could be nonfiction, fiction, or poetry, and you're going to get some of each of that kind. So that means anything from journalistic essays, opinion pieces, scientific articles, all of that could come under nonfiction. Under fiction, it's usually going to be like an excerpt from a short story, and poetry is poetry. So the trick here, unlike in revising editing part B, or the goal here is to process the information in the passage and to be able to answer questions about the information in the passage. And there's different kinds of questions that could be asked about the passage. That's not really something we have too much time to dive into right now. But later on in the workshop, we're going to be going over a passage together and looking at a few sample questions based on the passage. So you'll get more of an idea of the kinds of questions that can be asked about a passage at that point. So I'm going to write down. I appreciate the doodling. But you might have to do that on the notebook that I recommended you get, just to avoid distracting people. Reading and understanding fiction, nonfiction, and poetry passages. So you'll notice that on math and ELA, I've given a pretty straightforward list of topics, right? Reading comprehension, the question really isn't, oh, what's the topics that are going to be covered? Is it science, or is it, history or art or architecture? That doesn't matter, right? You are not bringing your prior knowledge of any subject to the table when it comes to reading comprehension. What really matters is how well you can comprehend what you're reading. So rather than discussing topics, we're thinking of it more in terms of skills that you need for reading comprehension, right? So reading and understanding these kinds of passages. And then I would say there's two sort of main ways to look at the skills that you need in order to do that, to do what is under number one. One is being able to understand the main idea of a passage or paragraph, and the other is, rather than main idea, to be able to locate evidence for a particular point in the passage and find the answer best supported by that specific piece of evidence, that exact sentence. So I like to talk of it in terms of zoom in and zoom out. You need the zoom in skills where you can find evidence, right? And use it to pick the best answer. And you need the zoom out skills where you can comprehend the passage as a whole and understand what the main idea of the whole passage is. So I'm going to write those down as well. So zoom in, locate evidence, and use it to find the best answer. And this is all multiple choice, right? Everything on this test is multiple choice except for those 5 grid-in questions on that. So that's the zoom in and zoom out. Identify the main idea. Oh, how are we gonna make it? Of a passage. Okay, so I would say that this is a fairly comprehensive view of everything that you need to know to be able to do well on the SHSAT. That's everything about the structure of the test and what's on it. We're going to be moving on to some tips and strategies for how best to approach the test in a second. Before I do that, does anyone have any questions about the structure of the test and about the content that is covered by the test? I like those shapes. Yeah, that's some of what comes under geometry and math, is sometimes you have to find out the volume of 3D shapes like these. And there's no formulas. I should mention that there's no formulas provided to you on the SHSAT, so you have to just know those formulas before you go in. And there's ways to memorize them that make them easier. You won't get tons and tons of 3D object volume questions. You might get one, so don't worry about it too much. Okay, so that's it for the structure of the test and what are the topics that are covered by the test. So next, I want to move on to some tips and strategies, okay, for approaching the test. And this is something that I'm going to be talking about, and I'll mention points one by one. And if you want to write them down, you can. I won't be using the whiteboard. So now that we understand the overall structure of the SHSAT, let's talk about how to actually approach the test. Like I said earlier, content is one aspect of the test and it's important, but the other aspect is test taking. So it's a long test, right? It's 3 hours. As far as I know, for the most part, 8th graders have not taken lots of 3-hour tests by that point. And it's something that you want to get used to. You don't want the day of the test to be the first time that you're taking a 3-hour test or the first time that you're practicing a full SHSAT. So it's important to take a few practice tests to get used to the way the test works. That's the first point, right? Take practice tests. Don't overdo it. Don't take one every other day. Don't even take one every week, but take a few by the time you get to the actual test. Second point, and I should say that I'm the last couple points that I'll be making are some of the key ones in terms of how you should approach the questions and things like that. But I'm starting off broader and getting more specific as I go. So first thing is that it's a long test. Mentally for that a little bit, and you want to physically for that, taking practice tests. The second point is that you can take the sections in any order. I mentioned this earlier. The SHSAT does not tell you how much time to spend on any section. It doesn't tell you which section to start with. Now, that doesn't mean that you can just dive in chaotically and do questions randomly and jump back and forth. That's not going to work out well. But it does mean that you can take advantage of that fact, right? So when you're taking practice tests, I recommend starting with the section that you like better, and then see how that works for you. See if you're getting exhausted halfway through a section, or see if you actually prefer knocking out the one that you're not as into and then saving the one that you know you're better at for the second half. Usually, I think the other way around works better, but these are things to experiment with in the practice test that you're taking. And when you experiment with them, pay attention to the results, right? See what worked for you and what didn't work for you, and come up with a clear plan. And if you have a tutor can help you with this, a clear plan and strategy for how you're going to take the test on test day. And most of the time, that's going to be first 90 minutes on the section you like more, second 90 minutes on the section that you like, but maybe not as much as the other one, right? Okay, that's the second point. You don't want a point where you're spending 110 on one section and you only have 70 minutes for the other section. That would not be good. So 90. Okay, so now the 2 points, you may have heard these before or not, but the 2 points that are really key to not losing points unnecessarily on the SHSAT, okay? So this is point 3. Each question on the SHSAT counts for exactly the same, right? Harder questions are not worth more than easy questions. So if a question is really challenging or you're not sure how to do it, don't linger on it, right? It's not going to get you more points just because you put more effort into it. So if a question looks really difficult, or you read it and you just know that you didn't practice this kind of thing enough, and it's going to take you like a while to figure it out, mark it on your question sheet, on your question paper, and come back to it at the end when you have extra time, a few minutes, to go over questions that you couldn't do the first time. Never dive into a question you find extremely difficult and spend as long as it takes to figure it out. No, like never do that, right? Not going to get you any more points. And then the is you have some extra time at the end and you can go back to some of those questions you were not as sure about. So that's point 3. Point 4 is somewhat related, which is that blank answers and wrong answers. In other words, if you choose there's no negative marking. It's just a 0 on the question. You're going back to the questions you couldn't do the first time. If you don't have time to really think about each one, at least yes, don't leave anything blank. There's some that you still just have no idea, but you can safely eliminate, let's say, 1 or 2 options. Maybe you can't eliminate anything. Maybe you're like, it could be any of these 4 options. I have no idea. That's fine. Just guess. Never linger too long on a question. If a question's hard, just mark it and come back to it on the second wave. And point 4 is that at least guess on everything. Don't leave anything blank. The exception is the grid in questions, right? You're not going to guess. If the number is 300, the odds of you guessing 300 and being correct are very small. But on the multiple choice questions, the odds of you guessing and being correct are 1 in 4, right? Those aren't bad odds. I mean, those are decent odds. If you can eliminate 1 or 2 answer choices, then the odds improve, right? So that's point 4, which is to at least guess on every single question. And that does mean that if you have some limited time at the end, let's say you have only 2 minutes, it's way more worth your time to go back to all the multiple choice questions and at least guess than it is to go back to those grid in questions and sit there struggling over them, right? You're going to spend a while struggling and you may or may not get it right. Whereas if you guess on all the multiple choice, I get at least some of them right for sure, right? Okay, so those are my kind of main tips and strategies for approaching the test as a whole. If you do test prep or tutoring for the test, I'm sure your tutor will give you some more strategies related to different kinds of questions, right? And when we do some practice questions together in just a second, we will also see if any of those come up, and they should. But those are my sort of overarching strategies for the SHSAT. So we're going through these questions sort of in order of how they would appear on the test. So this, can anyone tell me what section this question would belong to? What subsection of what section?
Revising and editing.
Yes, it would be under ELA in revising and editing, and it would be revising and editing part A. So when you start the ELA section, this kind of question is going to be one of the first questions that you see. You can see here that there's 4 sentences, and each has 2 different changes that could be made to one of these sentences. So could someone do me a favor and
Okay. Danielle spent several hours preparing for an upcoming edition for a play at the community theater. First, she did vocal exercises to practice her diction and projection so that her words would carry clearly throughout the auditorium. Then she studies the text of the monologue to better understand the emotions and motivations of the characters. Then she plans to portray. Finally, she recites the monologue in front of a mirror many times, making slight adjustments and improvements to her performance each time.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Great. So now, does anyone else, just so we hear as many voices as possible, has anyone noticed in what was just read anything that seems off? Any verb that doesn't match its subject or anything like that? And I should say, when it comes to grammar, right, it's good to know the rules and you should revise them, but don't be afraid to rely on your native English ear. You're all native English speakers. When something's really off, most of the time you can hear it, right? So did anyone notice something that seemed wrong?
There shouldn't be a comma after emotions because it's not really a list. There's only 2 things.
Exactly. Good. That's definitely wrong, right? I'm gonna use the annotate feature. Right. So here is what's being referred to. Emotions and motivations. That's 2 things with an and in the middle. We don't need a comma, right? You only need a comma if it's a list of 3 or more. Excellent. So that's one thing that's definitely off. Anything else?
Should study because the other one did and it wasn't does.
Yes.
So
I talked about subject-verb agreement inside a sentence, but there's other kinds of issues that could happen with verbs, not just that they don't match the subject. What about the fact that this whole passage is in the past tense, right? As was just pointed out. You can tell from all these other verbs. Danielle spent several hours. First, she did, right? Not spend and does, but spent and did. What are some other? Finally, she decided. All of these verbs are in the past tense. And then we have studies, which for some reason, even though it's just like these other verbs, it's just something that Danielle did, it's in the present tense, right? That stands out. That shouldn't be in the present tense. So as you can see, before we even looked at the answer choices, we are trying to see if anything stands out to us, anything looks off, right? That way, when we get to the answer choices, we will we'll be able to find the one that we want more easily. So good, we've already done the hard work, right? We found 2 mistakes. If you can find even one, don't spend ages searching, but if you can look out for it and find even one, that will help you narrow down your answer choices. So let's go through those one by one. A says, sentence 1, change spent to had spent and insert a comma after play. Usually if you're very sure about the mistakes you found, you can just find the answer choice that has those and just select it. But if you're not 100% sure, it's helpful to look at all of them and make sure you didn't miss anything or ignore anything. And sometimes one mistake will be in 2 different answer choices. So then you have to compare those ones. So we're going to look at the answer choices. So, okay. Danielle had spent several hours preparing for an upcoming audition for a play at the community theater. So I don't think that's right? Because we don't need to change this verb to whatever this would be called. I think it's past perfect or something. And we don't need to separate at the community theater from the rest of the sentence with a comma. You only do that with modifying clauses, clauses that add some extra information but don't belong to the main grammar of the sentence. Whereas here we have this word at, play at the community theater. At is already doing the hard work of linking the community theater to the rest of the sentence. We don't need to use a comma to clarify the relationship of this part of the sentence to everything else, right? So not that one. B says, sentence 2, change did to does. That's off because we know the whole passage is in the past tense, right? Sentence 3, change studies to studied, and delete the comma after motions. So those are both the issues that we identified. We're almost 100% sure that it's C, right? Sentence 4, D, change recited to recites, and delete the comma after times. I already know that this whole passage is in the past tense, so it's not going to be this, right? We found so much evidence for that, at least 3 different verbs. So the answer is C. So that's how you're going to approach this type of question. Yeah, good job, everyone. Thank you for your help on that. Clear the drawings and move on. I'll just quickly say that here, this is a question about the best way to combine these sentences to clarify the relationship. And on questions like this, you want to make sure that these conjunction words, right? These fanboys and non-fanboys that you might use to join 2 sentences, they appropriately reflect the relationship between the 2 sentences. And sometimes you don't even need them, right? Sometimes you use something like which just shows that one sentence is kind of offering evidence or extra information for the other sentence, what the other sentence is saying. Okay. Let's keep going. So now we're going to do a little bit of an exercise together. So now you can see, I'm sure that we've moved on to reading comprehension style questions where there is a passage and there's a few questions about the passage. So what I want to do for this is we're going to do a little live, like mini SHSAT, okay? But just reading comprehension. What I was about to have everyone do is get their notebook and a pencil, and I'm going to put 5 minutes on the clock, and I'm going to ask everyone to read this passage and answer the 3 questions that follow the passage. Write down what you think the answers are in your notebook, and then we'll go over them, and you can see how your thinking served you or didn't, what you missed, what you were able to catch, right? And then I know you can't see the 3rd question. I think I'll just routinely scroll down and then scroll back up a little bit so that you're able to answer that one. I'll do that a few times in the 5 minutes. Did you think it was tricky or did you think it was easy? So these are all questions pulled from an actual test. Okay, let's dive right in. So let's look at number 10 first. The words feat, humanly impossible, and impenetrable barrier in paragraph 1 affect the tone of the paragraph because. So this is a situation where I think it's important. I would call this a zoom in question. And I think it's important to look at those words, the ones that they've selected, in context, right? You're only going to know what those words are doing if you read them in the sentences that they're in. So I would go back to that spot, identify where those words are, potentially underline them, right? Feat, humanly impossible, and impenetrable barrier. And then I'll quickly give those sentences a second read, right? So in the 1950s, people compared running 1 mile in 4 minutes to scaling Mount Everest and nicknamed the feat a dream mile. Although such an accomplishment was considered humanly impossible, several elite runners aimed to break that supposedly impenetrable barrier. So before I even go to the answer choices, I've identified this as a zoom in question. I am going to do precisely that. I'm going to zoom in on the parts of the passage that are relevant to this question. And I'm going to reprocess that part of the passage and make sure that I understand what's going on. And what's going on here is that people thought this was impossible, right? They thought it was humanly impossible. They thought it was like scaling Mount Everest. And essentially, it was considered something that no one could possibly do, right? So now let's go back to the answer choices at this point and see which answer choice reflects our understanding of the passage where we just zoomed in. So E, these words highlight the idea that only the most skilled runners would be able to run a 4-minute mile. Now, this is one that you may not want to eliminate right off the bat because, okay, sure, if something's really impossible to do, then to do it, you'd have to be amazing. But the passage didn't really say that there were skilled runners who could do this, right? We want to stay very close to the facts of the passage. What the passage said was that this was considered impossible. So I might eliminate E altogether. If you're newer to the SHSAT, you might find it somewhat compelling, right? Because you could infer it from the text. Although we're trying not to make inferences, we're trying to stay very close to the test. Okay, let's look at F. So I'm going to go ahead and eliminate that one. F emphasized the idea that running a mile in less than 4 minutes was a seemingly unattainable goal. That's really strong, right? That's exactly what we just gleaned. G, convey the competitiveness among elite runners to consistently set and break speed records. Nothing was said about competition or people. Maybe later on the passage dives into that, right? But this is a zoom in question. We're zooming in on paragraph 1. That's not what it's talking about. So we eliminate G. H, show the intensity of the training programs athletes endure in order to achieve their goals. Similar to G, that's not what is being talked about in this paragraph. They did not talk about the details of training programs or athlete endurance, right? So our answer is F. It's a zoom in question. We zoomed in. We made sure we understood the relevant part of the passage, and we found the answer choice that reflects the understanding that we already had before we even got to the answer choices, right? We went back and we made sure that we had reprocessed the relevant part of the passage. And again, that's a zoom in type question. The zoom out ones tend to be about main idea overall. Some people like to leave those for the end of the passage. So before they move on to the next passage, they go back to those because at that point you've sort of read, you've zoomed in on so many spots that hopefully you have like an overall map. And some people just feel like they can do them right when they get to them. That kind of depends on you, and you'll see that in the practice test that you take. Okay, let's look at 11. And I have a feeling we're going to end up going to at least 12:15 because we haven't done a math problem yet. We're going to do one more reading comprehension question. And for the last one, I'll just tell you which one was right. Okay, how did interval training affect Bannister's performance? This is another zoom in question, right? The way that you know is because you can tell it's going to be based on some specific piece of evidence. It's about interval training, right? So you're going to go back to the passage and try and find the part that talks about interval training, and then read it very closely and use that. A zoom out question tends to look like, what was the main idea of this passage? Or how does this particular piece of evidence relate to the overall flow of ideas? I like to call those ones combo, but they do involve some zooming out. But this one, it's just based on a piece of evidence about interval training, right? So we go back up, we locate, where are they talking about interval training? So I'm scanning, interval training, paragraph 3, right? Bannister attacked the elusive milestone with positive attitude and logical planning. The amateur athlete decided to use intensive interval training to develop endurance and speed. For these workouts, he ran an interval of blah, 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 and then it talks about what interval training involved, right? The actual process. But the question asks, how did it affect his performance? So I'm going to read on a little bit because they don't quite get to that here, right? By early 1954, he had succeeded in lowering his quarter-mile pace to 61 seconds. So it seems to have improved his speed, at least, And then back in paragraph 3, it talks about using this kind of training to develop endurance and speed. So I'm looking for something in my answer choices that talks about speed and potentially also endurance, right? So now we go back down. How did it affect his performance? Helped him learn how to moderate his pace. I'm not so sure that they talked about that, right? They talked about the process of interval training, and they just said that it helped lower his pace. They didn't really say anything about him having to learn to moderate, so I don't know about that one. I'm gonna eliminate it. If you're ever unsure, you don't have to eliminate it. You can bring it down to 2 options and then consider them against each other. But I'm pretty certain that this one's wrong. B, it helped him understand the importance of running with the team. Nothing was said about a team, right? Remember, this is zoom in. Even if they use the word team somewhere else in the passage, I do not care. It's not relevant to this question, right? So we eliminate it. Helped him improve his pace and stamina. So we were looking for speed and endurance. These just seem to me to be synonyms for those 2 words, right? Speed is the same thing as pace, and stamina is the same thing as endurance. So that is something that you might see on the test, right? You're looking for matching meanings. You're looking to find the option that matches the meaning of the relevant part of the passage. Sometimes matching meanings doesn't mean matching words, right? So for instance, I don't know if we have an example here actually, but sometimes there's matching words and not matching meanings. Sometimes one answer choice will just pull a word from the passage, but it's not the right answer. The right answer is always going to be the one with matching meaning to the relevant part of the passage. So in this case, that would be C, right? Endurance and speed is the same thing as pace and stamina. And just to be sure we didn't miss anything, D, helped him decrease his recovery time. Again, I don't think that was supported as directly as C. So C would be our answer. Now, I know I said I would give you the answer to 12. So 12 is H. And in terms of why, we can't go into details, but H is going to be the one that does exactly what the question is asking. H best supports the idea that Bannister needed an alternative to logical planning in order to accomplish his goal. So sticking very close to the passage, right? And sticking very close to what the question is asking. Those are key. Okay, let's go on to math. So I've selected a few questions. This one involves algebra, because there's a missing variable. It's an equation. It also sort of involves PEMDAS, or making sure that your order of operations is correct. So I'm just going to solve this. And anyone who isn't sure how to approach it will hopefully learn from my solving it. So first things first, right? I brought up PEMDAS. If I see parentheses, I know that I need to tackle the parentheses first. If whatever's inside the parentheses can be solved, I want to, or any terms inside the parentheses, if they can be combined, I want to do that. In this case, that's not possible, right? Inside the parentheses, I have an X term, and then I have just an integer. And I can't actually add those. So I'm not going to be able to do anything inside the parentheses, but I do have this number outside the parentheses. And as you can see, there's nothing in between the -2, or you can think of that as -2, but it's -2. There's nothing in between that and the parentheses. And what does that mean? That means multiplication, right? -2 is being multiplied by what's in the parentheses. So I have to start there before I do anything else. And as I'm sure many of you know, or may or may not have practiced recently, we're going to be distributing the -2 and making sure we distribute it to both terms, right? So what do we end up with underneath? This is going to be messy. Zoom handwriting. 7x plus 3, we just write that the way it was already. -2 times 2x, so that's -4x and then -2 times +1. So one thing to remember here is positive times positive is positive, negative times positive, like we did with -2 and 2x, negative times positive is negative. And same situation here, right? -2 times +1, that's going to be a negative number. That's going to be -2. That equals 13. So now I've at least dealt with my parentheses, and I can just look at all these terms that I have as sort of all being on the same plane. So the next step is to combine the like terms, right? To group and combine the like terms. So all like terms should be together and should then be combined. And a like term just means that two terms are like, right, if they have the same variable or if they don't have a variable. So terms with the same variable are 7x and 4x, right? These are like terms. And it's actually a -4x, my bad. So we want to combine those. You can always rewrite the same expression underneath so that the like terms are next to each other. So those two terms are like. And then I also have a +3, a -2 that are not like with the x terms, right? And those are actually like with this 13 on the other side. So I want to make sure I'm grouping the like terms, which means that I have to bring that 3 and that -2 onto the other side. How do I do that? Now, this is the trick with algebra. The magic of algebra is that you can do absolutely anything you want, any operation, addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division, as long as you do the same thing on both sides, right? So at the moment, this +3 and -2 are sort of in my way, right? I want them to be on the other side. So I'm just going to subtract them, or I'm going to do the inverse of whatever's being done to get rid of them on the left. So subtract -3, add 2. And that means I have to do the exact same thing on the other side, right? I'm going to subtract 3, add 2. So on this side, I'm going to lose these. And I'm going to end up with 7x minus 4x equals 13 minus 3 plus 2. I'm just going to do that in my head, right? That's 10 plus 2, that's 12. So 7x minus 4x equals 12. We've combined all the non-x terms. Let's combine the x terms. So 7x minus 4x is going to be 3x equals 12. Now, remember how I said that in algebra you can do anything as long as you do it to both sides? So I should have said this right off the bat. The ultimate goal is to isolate the x, right? The question says solve for x. The way you solve for any variable in algebra is you isolate it. You keep doing the same thing on both sides until that variable is the only thing on one side, right? And then you just get an expression that's like x equals something. So can anyone tell me, what is the last step that I could take here in order to isolate the x?
Can
Yeah, go for it.
I? Okay. So basically you have to divide 12 by 3 to get, and like cancel out the 3 so that it turns into 4, and then you write x equals 4.
Right, so we're going to divide this side by 3, but the reason we're doing that is because we're also dividing this side by 3, right? Exactly. Awesome, thank you. So on this side, the 3's cancel out. 3 divided by 3 is just 1. 1x is the same thing as x. Right, so on the left side, 3 divided by 3 is just 1. 1x is just x, so we can essentially cancel out these 3's, right? And on the right side, as was astutely pointed out, you do something similar. 12 divided by 3 is just 4, or you cancel out the 3 and you cancel out the 12 and write 4. So x equals 4. So we talked about two things here, order of operations, right, or PEMDAS, and algebra. Now, I'm sure you all can observe that that's a small percentage of that list of math topics I gave you, right? But it's just a little taste of the kind of question that you can get on the SHSAT under math. We don't have time to actually do them, but I'm just going to
Aisha,
scroll.
you have a question. Sorry.
Oh, sure.
Is this type of question very common on the test?
I would say yes.
Yeah.
You can expect to find at least one question that looks like this. And oftentimes, you might even get algebraic word problems that expect you to come up with an equation based on some information you've been given, and then you have to solve for the equation. So I would say try and get comfortable with the skill of everything I just did and solving equations like this. If you're intimidated, that's natural, but don't be nervous, because it's really the kind of thing that it's the same skill set, the same tool set each time. There's no hidden, secrets or sort of twists and turns that the process can take. Solving for a variable involves the same thing each time, right? Grouping the like variables, combining them, and doing the same thing on both sides until you've isolated the variable. So yes, this is a skill you will use quite a lot on the SHSAT, but if that scares you, don't worry, it shouldn't scare you. With practice, you'll be able to do it just fine. Okay, we don't have time to dive in, but this is another example of a question you could see on the SHSAT. In math, I always recommend underlining what the question is asking for, because sometimes after the bulk of the math, there's like an extra little step to what they're asking for, and you never want to miss that. So I always, even if it's straightforward, I just underline what the question's asking for. So here they're asking for the value of angle X. And the skills you're going to use here are knowing what all the angles in a triangle add up to, right? They add up to 180. That's one piece of information you need. The other piece of information is knowing that vertical angles, so these angles here are vertical angles. They're sort of vertically opposite each other when two lines intersect. They're equal. So you're going to end up with, you're going to know what this angle is because of this one, because they're vertical angles. Oh, and also you're going to use a third piece of information, which is that the angle of a straight line is 180. So that's what you're going to use here. You're going to be able to calculate this angle because you know this one. And then you're going to have both of these angles, right? Excuse my horrible doodling on this page, but you're going to know both of these angles inside the triangle, and that will enable you to find out this one. And then that will enable you to find out X because, again, they're vertical angles like this. They're equal. Sorry for not going into that in more details, but those are the kinds of pieces of information that you will want to have in geometry. Angles in a triangle add up to 180. Angles adding up to a straight line add up to 180. And vertical angles are always equal to each other. As long as you have those facts, you can pretty much always figure out the value of an angle in questions like this. And then the last one I want to show is a word problem. So we're going to use this word problem to set up a ratio or set up an equation that has ratios in it. We're not going to solve for the X just now because we don't have time, but I at least want to set it up. So let me read the problem. A train travels 2,200 miles from Phoenix to New York City. The train covers the first 240 miles in 5 hours. If the train continues to travel at this rate, how many more hours will it take to reach New York City? So that's what I'm going to underline, right? That's what the question's asking. How many more hours will it take to reach New York after the first 5? Round your answer to the nearest whole hour. What they're asking here is how much time is it going to take for the rest of the journey, right? After this has already happened. So the first thing I want to do is figure out how many miles are left in the rest of the journey. At the moment, they've given us the total number of miles traveled, but I want to be using just the number of miles that are left in my calculations, right? So first thing I'm going to do is, subtract the number of miles that have already been traveled from the total number of miles. So if I'm not mistaken, that's 1960. if I got that wrong, that would be really embarrassing. Sometimes when I have 30 people watching me, these things happen. So let me know if I did get that wrong. And now the heart of this problem is to set up an equation using ratios that will allow me to solve for what I want to know, right? What I'm looking for, which is how many more hours it'll take to reach New York. So the way I'm going to use ratios for this is that I know it takes 5 hours for 240 miles. So that relationship, right, of hours to miles, the ratio of hours to miles is going to be the same. No matter how many miles I travel, the number of hours is going to grow in a way that's proportionate to the number of miles. So I can use that fact, right? The fact that hours to miles is always a stable ratio. The numbers may change, but the ratio between them is always stable to set up an equation. Because I know that the ratio of 5 to 240 is going to be the same, identical, equal to the ratio of the mystery number of hours, right? What I'm looking for, my x, to the remaining number of miles traveled, which is, again, I hope, 1960. And at this point, I have an algebraic equation with a missing variable, and I can just solve for x, which I would do by multiplying both sides by this denominator, right? That will isolate my x for me. So that's how you would attempt a problem like this. The person who was asking whether the kind of problem that we did earlier with algebra, whether it's common, yes, it is. And you'll also see problems like this where you have to come up with the equation based on information provided. That's everything that I wanted to go over with you guys today. We talked about the outline, the structure of the test, right? The different sections and subsections, the types of questions. We talked about all the different topics that will come up on the SHSAT and the skills that you need to build to be able to take the SHSAT. Then we talked about some tips and strategies for how to approach a test of this length and the fact that there's no negative marking, that you shouldn't spend too much time on any one question. So we talked about strategies like that. And then lastly, we went over some practice problems. Thank you so much for being here.